and started kissing one of our guests, right? That'd be weird. However, for the first century Palestinian, not so much. It was kind of a reversal of how we are. So that is the setting for our scripture today. A devout Jew, Simon, known as a Pharisee, has invited Jesus to his home for a meal. We don't really know Simon's motives because Luke doesn't explain them, but we do begin to formulate an impression of his character in the way that he responds to the uninvited guest who comes into his meal. Of course, in the eyes of the host, she was not just an ordinary woman. She was a woman who at some point in her life had strayed off the path of choices and behaviors that were considered acceptable, moral, righteous, according to Jewish law. And so this sinner woman kneels before Jesus and begins to anoint him with her tears and with her jar of costly oil. And to this, Simon takes offense. Although it isn't really clear to me with whom he is offended, the woman who has crashed his party or Jesus who lets her. Now we're going to do a little bit of study here on the Greek that Luke used to write this text so that we can get at what he means here with this story. The first word I want to call your attention to is the word that Simon uses when he talks about what the woman is doing to Jesus. He uses the Greek word apttai, which our scripture translates as touching, but the Greek conveys something just a little bit different than that. It's not just any kind of touching going on here. And I want to be clear, this is not a sexual or explicit word in any way. That's not Simon's problem. Rather, apttai is a word that conveys a kind of a desperate touching, like a grasping or a clutching from someone who is in dire need. It is interesting to me that Simon uses apttai to describe the woman's behavior. It is almost as if his disgust of her isn't really about her uncleanness or her sinfulness, but rather it is because she is so needy and so helpless and so vulnerable that he finds her loathsome. It really makes you wonder, does Simon have any clue who it is he invited to dinner? Jesus' response to Simon is both classy and snarky in a way that probably only the Son of God could get away with. He first tricks Simon into answering a question about human relationships that most school children could probably get right. If a very generous lender releases one person from a great debt and another person from a lesser debt, who will love him more? Frankly, my 7-year-old could probably puzzle that one out. But Jesus doesn't leave Simon alone to connect the dots himself between this riddle and the woman. Instead, he follows up with another question. And in that question, we hear a word that leads us back to that apttai word in verse 39. Jesus looks at Simon and he says to him, Simon, do you see this woman? And he uses a word in Greek, lepis, and it doesn't really mean physical seeing. Because, of course, Simon is offended, but he is not blind, right? I mean, Jesus gets that. What he's really asking Simon here is, can you feel her? Can you feel her pain? Can you empathize with her? Can you touch her the way that she is touching me and let her vulnerability make contact with you like that? Now, you and I might miss the subtlety of that exchange, but I guarantee you that Luke's audience did not. To make our understanding of this story complete, we have to now put, I think, what we know about the two kinds of touching in the story together with two other words. And our Bible translates them as forgiveness. That there are actually, again, two different words going on here. When Jesus is telling the riddle, the thing about the lender, he uses the Greek word charisata to describe the choice of the lender to release the debtors from their debt. And in Greek, this word means to pardon somebody in a way that provides personal reward for you. You get some benefit out of it. Now, Luke doesn't tell it, means to imply that this lender forgave the debt in a public way so that people might, admire him for his magnanimity and his generosity or what. But there's something in the way that Jesus is speaking there that kind of conveys that there's sort of honor in it for the lender here. This is different, though. Then Jesus turns to the woman at his feet, and he looks right at her, and he uses a different word. He uses the word aphetai, which means to forgive somebody at personal cost to yourself. It is the opposite of the word that Jesus used in reference to the lender. Clearly, we can gather which of these two versions of forgiveness best applies to the model that Jesus set. And it is easy to see, even if Simon was blind to it, it is easy to see which kind of forgiveness Jesus thought this woman deserved, which was best for her. Touching is and always has been a powerful form of communication between human beings. But when sin touches us, we often recoil, don't we? And I don't actually think Jesus would chastise us for that response, as long as that doesn't become our final response. In his exchange with Simon, Jesus clearly lays out what we are to do next. Each is a step and a path toward releasing the sinner to freedom, to a new life. And not ironically, to releasing ourselves from the trap of letting someone else's sin become the opportunity for our own, right? Empathy and forgiveness is what he calls us to, and nothing less will do in these cases. The exchange is only a few moments long, but in that few moments, Jesus completely reorients us to the nature of sin, and we walk away from this story with a different idea about who the real sinner is and what we are called to do in response. I want to thank you for your patience today. This kind of Bible study is not easy to do, but it is, when you ask questions like you ask, those really good questions, you have to do this in order to try to get at them. I mentioned at the start that in our house, when our children were small, we used the phrase gentle touches to teach them. It was actually my husband who coined that phrase. And this is what I see so many of you, the spiritual parents of this congregation, the fathers and the mothers alike, who show by your example how we are to be. I see you doing this, these gentle touches here among our faith community. You do not keep your hands to yourselves. You do not keep your hands to yourselves, thank God. You regularly reach out with empathy and provide the gentle touch of Jesus when you find someone in need. We may not live in first century Palestine, but we do regard this, our church, and our world as being both a social and a sacred space. And in that space, I encourage you not to be blind to those who are desperate and wounded with sin among us. Reach out, as I know you can, when they come before us, and let us offer that extraordinary forgiveness, that Jesus kind of forgiveness that sets people free. Amen.